This is not a review or even a proper critical evaluation of Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. Instead, I'll peel back the storytelling mechanics to lay bare the reasons why this film has endured. By 1988, the cinematic Cold War was already brewing between Paramount's Friday the 13th franchise and New Line Cinema's A Nightmare on Elm Street series. And Jason was losing the battle at the box office. Paramount suspected that the best days of their hack-and-slash properties were behind them, and that the market viability for future installments was increasingly bleak. Still, the cost-to-profit ratio was still, for the moment, a lossless proposition, so a seventh installment in the saga was an inevitability. It's a clear indication of Paramount's lack of confidence in their franchise that they pursued the concept of a Friday Nightmare crossover, but abandoned it when they were rebuffed by New Line. Only a few years later, New Line were able to secure the rights to Jason and bring the idea to fruition on their own terms. If Jason was the king titan of the slashers in the early 1980s, Freddy had snatched away that crown in the latter half of the decade. Needing a new path forward, the producers kept the idea of a supernatural climatic battle, but changed Jason's opponent. It has been said that Tina, the movie's telekinetic-enabled heroine, was modeled after Carrie White, the titular character of Stephen King's novel and the subsequent Brian De Palma film. But that's a gross oversimplification. Carrie's powers served as a means to leverage a broad, metaphoric, revenge fantasy storyline, the central concept relying on the commonality of teenage ostracism, disconnect, and self-pity. Both novel and movie work best as negatively charged nostalgia, encouraging the viewer to remember their own high school years not through the rose-tinted glasses, but rather through cynicism and desperation. Tina is none of those things. Ruled by guilt over an uncontrollable psychic tantrum that left her father dead, her powers and her character arc are essentially therapeutic. Using her rage to counteract her mother's murder counteracts the guilt associated with killing the other parent. At the beginning of the film, she's an awkward, social, tittering mess just coming out of institutional life. At the end, she's strong and empowered. Her final words? "We took care of him." An underlying theme of the film is the effect of a parent's death on the surviving offspring. Both of Tina's parents die in the course of New Blood's running time, of course, but the film never asks the viewer to react to either event. Neither is staged for massive emotional response, but rather as a mechanical plot point, a justification for Tina's rage that will ultimately defeat Jason. This approach is probably for the best considering the parallels between Tina and Mrs. Voorhees' story, which would make it difficult to navigate a narrative that asks for a sympathetic response to one but not the other. Mrs. Voorhees loses her son to the waters of Crystal Lake, projecting her wrath at the camp counselors not watching Jason, but she never expects responsibility for her absence when he needed her supervision. Likewise, Tina is unable to come to grips with her own lack of control, which caused her father to drown in the same lake. If anything, Mrs. Voorhees might be the easier of the two with which to identify, as she played no direct role in Jason's death. If Jason's resurrection can be considered a supernatural outgrowth of his mother's rage, then Tina's powers certainly come from the childhood fears and anger over the breakdown of the American family. As we're introduced to young Tina, she's a witness to domestic abuse. She runs from the problem, both literally and physically, and spends the rest of the film until her mother's death continuing to flee. She only stops her flight after her mother's murder and decides to fight, weaponizing her mental power she inadvertently used to kill her father to defend herself, to survive. This is Tina's rehabilitation program. Electrocution by power wire, flower pot to the head, porch roof collapse, strangulation by power cord, glass lamp to the face, 2-floor freefall, rusty nail to the forehead, full body burn, constricting mask straps, and house explosion. Ultimately, the destruction of her childhood home, though traumatic, is necessary to allow her to continue her life without the restraints of the house by the lake. She no longer has to return to the place where she killed her father, because it no longer exists. Similarly, by resurrecting her father as her final weapon against Jason, she completes the cycle of embracing the past and using it as a strength rather than a hindrance. As much as fans detest Mr. Shepard's appearance at the end of the film, thematically, it makes perfect sense. I'd go as far as to suggest that the studio is right to insist that Mr. Shepard not be a decaying zombie. The battle at that point is entirely inside Tina's head. She should see her father as she remembers her father. After all, by any serious logic, Jason's childhood body should have disintegrated completely in the lake long before his own resurrection. Insisting on a realistic approach at this point is beyond silly. Friday the 13th Part 7's subtitle, The New Blood, refers equally to the new batch of college-age Jason bait as it does to Tina herself. Blood often refers to lineage. A man's daughter is also his blood. It also, no doubt, referred to Paramount's hope to interject some new interest into the franchise. This chapter is often name-checked as a fan favorite. at least for this era in the series' history, but its box office receipts are another matter. Although it maintained its predecessor's $19 million box office, it was clear that no new moviegoers had been roped in by the newest gimmick. Jason would have one more chance at Paramount. The executives began rearranging the deck chairs and watching the waters rise.